Verath 6 was not the kind of planet anyone fought wars over. It was flat, dry, and covered in red dirt that got into everything, no matter how hard you tried to keep it out. The wind blew constantly, and the sky had a color like old copper, and the 400 humans who lived there had chosen it precisely because nobody else in the galaxy wanted it. They were farmers mostly, families who had left Earth or its bigger colonies looking for quiet and room to breathe. They grew grain that could survive the alkaline soil and raised small herds of animals they had brought from home. And they lived in low buildings made from local stone, with solar panels on every roof. It was not glamorous, but it was theirs, and they loved it the way people love things they have built with their own hands. Among them was a girl named Meera Castillo, who was 7 years old and had dark eyes that watched everything twice. She was small even for her age, and she rarely spoke, but when she did, people tended to listen because she never wasted a single word. She lived with her grandfather Tomas in a homestead at the edge of the settlement, where the farm fields met the open desert. Tomas was a retired xenobiologist who had spent 30 years studying alien ecosystems on 6 different worlds. He had a bad knee and white hair that stood up in every direction, and a laugh that could be heard 3 buildings away. When he came to Verath 6, he brought something unusual with him. A small conservation enclosure behind the house, filled with earth animals that were part of a species preservation grant. There were lizards and a pair of hawks and some rabbits and one creature that was none of those things. His name was Sergeant. Sergeant was a honey badger, a male, old, scarred across his muzzle and shoulders, with small black eyes that held absolutely no warmth and no fear and no patience for anything that breathed. He was about the size of a medium dog, but built like a brick wrapped in loose leather, with claws that could tear through hard-packed earth and jaws that could crack a tortoise shell. He smelled terrible, and he hated everything alive, except for one person on the entire planet. That person was Meera. Nobody understood why. Tomas certainly did not. But Sergeant tolerated the girl in a way he tolerated nothing else. She could sit beside him, and he would not growl. She could touch his scarred back, and he would not snap. She brought him scraps of food, and he took them from her fingers gently, which was a word nobody had ever used to describe anything Sergeant did. It was not love exactly, not in any way the galaxy would recognize, but it was something, and it was real. The day everything changed started with a shadow that fell across the sky. Not a cloud, but a ship, enormous, dark, sliding over the colony like a hand closing over a candle flame. Then came more ships, smaller ones, dropping from the belly of the first like seeds falling from a pod, and they landed in the fields and crushed the grain under their weight without a second thought. The Kelvori Dominion had arrived. They were tall, taller than any human by a full head, with bodies like insects wrapped in smooth chitinous armor that was part of their biology and part of their technology, all at once. They had too many joints in their arms, and their eyes were compound clusters that reflected light like broken glass, and they carried weapons called pulse lances that could burn a hole through stone at 50 meters. They moved with the mechanical precision of creatures who had never once in their evolutionary history doubted that they were the most dangerous thing in any room. Their commander was called Sevik, and he walked like he owned the ground beneath him, which as far as the Dominion was concerned, he did. Verath 6 sat on top of a mineral deposit that the Dominion had recently decided it wanted, and wanting was the same as owning when you had a fleet in orbit. Sevik gathered the colonists in the central square and told them they had 1 planetary rotation to leave. No negotiation, no compensation, no appeal. The Dominion had claimed this world under Section 9 of its expansion charter, and the humans were expected to comply. His translating device turned his clicking insectoid speech into flat, cold English that had no room in it for argument. Tomas stepped forward because somebody had to. He was old and his knee hurt, and he was not brave so much as stubborn, which on a frontier colony amounted to the same thing. He asked for time, for dialogue, for some small recognition that 400 people had built lives here and could not simply be thrown away like broken tools. Sevik looked down at him the way a boot looks at an insect, and struck him across the face with the back of his armored hand. Tomas hit the ground hard, and blood ran from a cut above his eye, and Meera screamed his name and ran to him, and the other colonists surged forward, but the soldiers raised their pulse lances, and the crowd went still. The message was clear: comply or suffer. There would be no dialogue, because dialogue required the assumption that both sides were equal, and the Dominion did not make that assumption about humans. To them, humanity was a minor species, tolerable, forgettable, taking up space on worlds that could be put to better use. The soldiers established a perimeter, and the colonists were sent back to their homes with guards posted at every corner. Meera helped Tomas walk back to their homestead. His face was swelling, and his hands were shaking, but not from pain. He was shaking because he was angry in the way that quiet men get angry, deep and slow, and without any place to put it. That night the colony was silent under alien patrol. Lights swept across the buildings at regular intervals, and the hum of Calvori generators filled the air like a low sickness. Meera could not sleep. She went outside in the dark, and sat on the ground beside Sergeant's enclosure. He was awake because honey badgers are mostly nocturnal, and because Sergeant never really seemed to sleep anyway. He pressed his nose against the wire, and she pushed her small fingers through to touch his broad, flat head. "They hurt Abuelo," she whispered. Sergeant did not purr. Honey badgers never purr. He just watched her with his black, unblinking eyes. Morning came to Verath 6 the way it always did, slow and copper-colored and full of wind. But this morning was different, because the sound of tearing metal joined the wind as Calvori soldiers began pulling apart the colony's outer buildings with their bare hands and cutting tools. They did not ask which buildings were empty. They simply started at the edges and worked inward, stripping solar panels from roofs and tossing furniture into piles, and scanning walls for mineral traces, as though the homes were nothing more than rock formations that happened to have doors. A child's drawing fluttered from a broken wall and landed in the red dirt, and a soldier's boot crushed it without slowing down. Commander Sevik watched all of this from a command platform that his troops had assembled in the square overnight. He was reviewing the Dominion's xenobiology files on Earth, not because he was concerned, but because protocol required him to check. And what he found made him feel even less concerned than before. Earth was classified as a Class 4 death world, which sounded impressive until you read the details and realized the Dominion had 17 classifications, and Class 4 was somewhere in the middle. Dangerous enough to note, but not dangerous enough to respect. The file on humans was short. Low-threat endurance predators, it called them. A species that had evolved to chase things until they fell down, which Sevik found almost embarrassingly primitive. Their military capability was listed as moderate, their technology as derivative, and their fauna was dismissed in a single line that read, "Diverse but unremarkable megafauna, with no militarized species detected." That single line was the most dangerous sentence in the entire Dominion database. Sub-Officer Rin knew this even if Sevik did not. She was the detachment's intelligence analyst, younger than most of the soldiers and quieter, with a habit of reading files that nobody else thought were important. She had been studying humans for 2 years as a personal project, and the more she learned, the more uneasy she became. Not because of anything humans had done to the Dominion, but because of something in their nature that had no equivalent anywhere else in the known galaxy. Humans bonded with other species. Not the way the Calvori domesticated hive insects for labor. That was simple biological programming, chemical commands that overrode the insect's will. Humans did something completely different. They took wild creatures, dangerous creatures, creatures with teeth and claws and venom, and they simply sat with them, fed them, spoke to them, and waited, sometimes for generations, until those creatures chose to stay. They did not conquer the animals of their world. They made alliances with them. And those alliances ran deeper than any treaty, because they were written not in language, but in something older and stranger, that Rin did not have a word for in her own tongue. She tried to explain this to Sevik. She stood before his command platform and told him that the psychological profile of humans suggested they would not evacuate peacefully, that their attachment to place and to each other and to their animals created a kind of stubbornness that was not strategic but biological, and that pushing them would produce resistance, the way pressing on a nerve produces pain. Sevik told her to return to her station. The morning wore on, and the demolition continued. Soldiers moved deeper into the colony, herding families out of their homes, with pulse lances held at low ready. The colonists went because they had no weapons, and because pulse lances do not care about courage. But they went with a look in their eyes that Rin recognized from her research. It was the look humans got right before they did something the galaxy would later describe as insane. It was almost midday when a squad reached Tomas's homestead. They kicked open the conservation enclosure, and the hawks burst skyward, and the rabbits scattered into the scrub, and the lizards vanished into cracks in the stone. One soldier found Sergeant's smaller cage, and opened it with a careless boot, and Sergeant did not run. He turned and faced the soldier, and from his throat came a sound like someone tearing a sheet of metal in half, low and raw and full of a promise that did not need translation. The soldier laughed and prodded him with a pulse lance set to its lowest charge. It was enough to stun most small animals, enough to send them yelping and running. But Sergeant was not most small animals. He took the shock, and his body jerked, and his fur stood on end. And then he shook himself once, and lunged at the soldier's foot, and his jaws closed on the composite armor of the boot, and bit clean through it. The soldier screamed, not a battle cry but a genuine scream of surprise and pain, and kicked wildly. And two more soldiers rushed in, and Sergeant released the boot, and turned on them with that same terrible sound, and it took 4 soldiers to corner him, and a containment field generator to finally lock him down in a shimmering blue cage of energy. During all of this, Meera had been watching. She had tried to run to Sergeant, and had been grabbed by a soldier who held her by the arm, while she kicked and clawed and shouted words in Spanish that she had learned from her grandfather, and that no 7-year-old should have known. Tomas tried to reach her, and was struck again, this time in the stomach, and he folded to his knees in the dirt. The colonists were herded to a holding area in the center of the settlement, a flat space between buildings ringed by armed guards, where families sat together on the bare ground and spoke in low voices about what might happen next. Sevik announced that the evacuation ships would arrive at dawn, and that anyone still on the planet's surface after departure would be classified as hostile and dealt with accordingly. Night fell, and the colony went quiet under patrol, but in a small cabin at the edge of the command zone, Rin was not quiet at all. She was sitting in front of her data terminal, pulling every Earth file she could find, and she had finally located the entry on Mellivora capensis, the honey badger. She read it once, and her mandibles went still. She read it a second time, and her compound eyes adjusted in a way that her species only did when processing a threat assessment of the highest order. She read it a third time, and her hands began to tremble, not with excitement, but with something her people called kethvan, a word that translated roughly to the understanding that you have made a terrible mistake, and that the consequences are already in motion. She opened a communication channel to Sevik. It rang and rang and rang in the dark. The colony was dark and the wind had stopped. That was the first strange thing, because on Verath 6 the wind never stopped. It was as though the planet itself was holding its breath, waiting for something it knew was coming, even if no one else did. Meera lay on the ground in the holding area with her grandfather's coat pulled over her shoulders. Around her the other colonists slept, or pretended to sleep, their breathing shallow and uneven, the kind of breathing people do when they are afraid and trying not to show it. Tomas was beside her, with his face swollen and bruised, but his hand still resting on her head, the way it always did when she needed to know he was there. She waited until his hand went heavy with sleep, and then she moved. A 7-year-old should not have been able to slip past armed alien soldiers in the dark. Any reasonable tactical assessment would have said so. But reasonable tactical assessments were built on the assumption that the thing you were guarding against was a threat you had thought to imagine. And the Kelvori had not thought to imagine a child. Their guards were positioned to watch for adult humans moving in groups, for weapons, for communication devices. They were not watching for a girl who weighed less than their rifles, and who moved through shadows the way water moves through cracks in stone. Meera had grown up on this colony. She knew every gap between buildings, every drainage ditch, every place where the ground dipped low enough to hide a small body. She crawled on her belly through the red dirt, and she did not make a sound. Not because she had been trained, but because something inside her was operating on an instinct older than training. An instinct that said, be small, and be silent, and get to the thing you need to get to. She found Sergeant's containment unit behind the command zone. It was a portable field generator about the size of a large crate, humming with blue light, and inside it, Sergeant was pacing. Not frantically the way a scared animal paces, but slowly and deliberately, the way a creature paces when it is counting the seconds until it can do what it was born to do. The containment field was Kelvori technology, and Meera did not know how to hack it. She was 7, not an engineer, but she knew one thing about Kelvori tech that her grandfather had taught her on long afternoons when they worked on the farm equipment together. Their systems were sensitive to bioelectric interference, which was a fancy way of saying that if you pressed your bare hands against certain components and pushed your own body's tiny electrical field into the circuits, things sometimes reset. She had used this trick to fix jammed agrodrones a dozen times. Tomas had called it the Meera method and laughed every time it worked, and it worked more often than it should have, because human bioelectricity was messy and unpredictable in ways that Kelvori engineering was not designed to handle. She pressed both palms flat against the emitter node at the base of the generator. She could feel the hum vibrating through her bones and her teeth, and the small hairs on her arms stood straight up. She closed her eyes and pushed the way Abuelo had shown her, not with her muscles, but with something underneath, something quiet and stubborn and alive. The field flickered. It flickered again. It dropped. Sergeant stepped out of the containment unit, and the blue light died, and the hum went silent, and for a moment, the only sound in the world was the animal's breathing, slow and steady and ready. He looked at Meera, and she looked at him, and neither of them moved. His black eyes caught the faint light of the alien stars overhead, and reflected nothing back. No warmth, no softness, just a flat and ancient attention that predated every civilization in the galaxy. Then the patrol came. 10 Kelvori soldiers rounded the corner of the command building in formation. They moved with their pulse lances raised and their compound eyes adjusting to the dark, and the squad leader spotted Meera immediately and barked an order in a clicking voice that the translator turned into, "Return to the holding area now." One of the soldiers reached for her arm. Meera looked down at Sergeant. He was standing beside her, low to the ground, his body completely still. She could feel the muscles beneath his loose, scarred skin, and they were not relaxed. They were coiled so tight that he was vibrating, a tremor so fine it was almost invisible. And she knew what it meant, the way she had always known what he meant, without words. She put her small hand on his back. She whispered one word. Go. What happened next took 87 seconds. The Calvori soldiers' helmet cameras recorded all of it, and the footage would later be classified at the highest level of Dominion security. Not because it showed a military defeat, but because it showed something the Dominion had no framework to understand. Sargent launched himself at the nearest soldier with a sound that came from somewhere deeper than his throat. It was a shriek, high and raw and absolutely unhinged, the war cry of an animal that had spent 60 million years evolving on a planet where everything was trying to kill everything else, and had come out the other side, not bigger or faster or smarter, but simply more willing to keep fighting than anything it. He hit the first soldier at the knee joint, where the chitin armor had a seam. His claws, built to rip through sun-baked earth and tear into beehives guarded by 1,000 stinging insects, punched through the composite plating like it was wet paper. The soldier went down screaming, and Sargent was already moving, already turning, already launching himself at the second. The second soldier fired his pulse lance. The bolt hit Sargent in the side, and his body jerked, and he tumbled across the ground. And the soldiers must have thought it was over, because they paused for half a second. And that half second was the last mistake 3 of them would ever make. Sargent got up. He simply got up the way he always got up, the way honey badgers have always gotten up, because pain was just information, and information was not a reason to stop. He went for the throats and the joints, and the gaps between armor plates. His loose skin, so thick and so slack that claws and teeth simply slid across it without reaching the muscle beneath, made him almost impossible to grab. A soldier seized him, and he twisted inside his own hide, like a creature made of liquid, and sank his teeth into the arm that held him. And those jaws that could crack a tortoise shell crunched through chitin. And the soldier let go, and stumbled back, spraying pale blood. They shot him again, he got up. They kicked him, he got up. A soldier drove a pulse lance into him like a spear, and the energy discharge lit up the dark, and Sargent's body convulsed, and for one terrible second he was still on the ground. And then he was not still. He was up and he was moving, and he was screaming that impossible shriek, and he hit the soldier who had stabbed him with so much force that the soldier fell backward over his own legs. 10 soldiers, trained, armored, armed with weapons that could cut through stone, and one animal that weighed less than any of them, and bled from a dozen wounds, and did not stop, could not stop, had never in 60 million years of evolution been given the option to stop. 87 seconds. When it was over, Sargent stood in the middle of them, breathing hard. His fur was matted with blood, some of it his own and some of it not, and his legs were shaking, and one of his ears was torn, and he was still growling, a low rumble that said he was not finished, that he would never be finished, that the concept of finished was something the honey badger had simply never evolved to understand. He limped back to Meera. She had not moved. She had stood perfectly still through all of it, with her hands at her sides, and her dark eyes open and watching. She had not screamed, and she had not looked away, because she was a child of Earth, and Earth does not look away from what it has made. Sargent pushed his broad, flat head against her knee, and she knelt in the dirt and wrapped her arms around him and held him while his blood soaked into her clothes and his heartbeat hammered against her chest like a drum. Across the colony the alarms began to shriek, lights blazed on, and soldiers scrambled from their posts, and Rin's voice cut through every communication channel at once, sharp and shaking and stripped of all professional calm. "Commander, I tried to warn you. That creature is from Earth. They are all from Earth. You need to understand what that means." In the dark, holding her bleeding, unbroken, impossible animal, Meera said nothing. The footage was 30 seconds into its first playback, when the first soldier in the command tent asked to leave. He did not say why, and Commander Sevik did not ask, because the answer was on the screen, and it did not need to be spoken out loud. They watched a small Earth animal rip through 10 armed Kelvori soldiers in 87 seconds. They watched it get shot and get up, and get hit and get up, and get stabbed with a pulse lance that should have killed anything its size 3 times over, and get up. They watched it move with a speed and fury that had no place inside a body that small. And they watched it do all of this, not because it had been ordered to, or programmed to, or forced to, but because a human child had put her hand on its back and whispered a single word. Sevik made them watch it twice. By the time the second viewing ended, 4 more soldiers had left the tent, and the ones who remained were standing very still, in the way that prey animals stand still when they realize the shadow above them has wings. "What is it?" Sevik asked, and for the first time since he had landed on Verath 6, his voice did not carry the weight of a commander who believed he was in control. Rin told him. She stood before the remaining officers, with her data files projected in the air between them, and she spoke in a voice that was steady only because she had rehearsed this in her cabin an hour before. She told them about Mellivora capensis, the honey badger, an animal from a planet called Earth that weighed between 9 and 16 kilograms, and had a documented history of fighting lions, surviving cobra bites, raiding beehives guarded by thousands of stinging insects, and simply refusing, at a biological, neurological, and apparently philosophical level, to accept that it could lose. "It is not the most dangerous animal on their planet," Rin said, and she paused to let that information settle into the silence, the way a stone settles into deep water. "It is not even close to the most dangerous animal on their planet. It is simply the most stubborn. And on Earth, stubbornness is a survival strategy that has been tested for 60 million years against every predator, every climate, and every extinction event their world could produce." Then she told them the part that made 3 officers request immediate transfer back to the fleet. She told them about the others. She pulled up the full Earth biodiversity file. Not the one-line summary in the Dominion database, but the real one, the complete one, the one she had spent 2 years compiling, from human sources and academic records and cultural archives. She showed them dogs, which were wolves that humans had spent 40,000 years turning into companions so loyal they would die rather than leave their human side. She showed them horses, a 1,000-pound prey animal that humans had taught to charge into cannon fire and sword lines, and do it willingly. She showed them hawks that humans trained to hunt and return to the hand, and elephants that mourned their human keepers, and dolphins that herded fish into human nets without being asked. "Do you understand what you are seeing?" Rin asked. And she was not asking a rhetorical question. She needed to know they understood, because if they did not, then more soldiers would die tonight. They do not enslave these creatures. They do not use chemical control or neural implants or genetic reprogramming. They sit with an animal, and they feed it, and they speak to it, and they wait, sometimes for years, sometimes for generations, until the animal chooses to stay. The child did not command that honey badger. She asked it, and it said yes. Sevik was quiet for a long time. The hum of the command tent's generator filled the silence, and somewhere outside, a patrol was reporting unusual movement near the western perimeter. He finally asked the question that had been building since the footage started. "What do we do now?" He never got to act on the answer, because the colonists were already moving. Tomas Castillo should have been in the holding area, with a swollen face and bruised ribs and no plan. Instead, he was standing in the dark behind the colony's grain silo, with 37 other colonists who had slipped away from their guards, using the same gaps and ditches and low ground that Meera had used. They were farmers, not soldiers, but they knew this land the way the Kelvori never would. They knew where the ground was soft, where the wind carried sound, and where it swallowed it, where the drainage channels ran deep enough to hide a crawling human. And they had the animals. The hawks came back first. Tomas had raised them from chicks, and they knew his whistle. And they came screaming out of the dark sky like feathered missiles, and dove at the Kelvori sensor arrays on the perimeter towers. Their talons raked across the delicate equipment, and alarms shrieked and soldiers spun toward the sky, trying to track targets that moved faster than their compound eyes could follow. Then the dogs came. 3 farm dogs. Not war dogs, not trained for combat, just dogs who had lived with these people and eaten from their hands and slept at their feet. And when the humans moved in the dark, the dogs moved with them. They barked from one direction and drew a patrol east, while the colonists moved west. They circled behind guard posts and snarled and snapped and vanished into the night before a single shot could find them. The mule, an old, stubborn, foul-tempered creature named Brick, who had been the colony's pack animal for 6 years, kicked open a supply container that the soldiers had left near the western gate, scattering Kelvori rations and equipment across the ground, and creating enough noise and confusion that a group of colonists was able to reach the water pumping station and shut it off. The Kelvori were not losing a battle. They were being disrupted and confused and harassed by a collection of farm animals and unarmed humans who knew the terrain. And the effect was devastating, not because of the damage, which was minor, but because of what it did to the soldiers' minds. They felt hunted. Not by a superior force, not by advanced weapons, not by anything they had been trained to fight. They felt hunted by a biosphere, by a planet's worth of creatures that seemed to be working together, not because they shared a language or a strategy, but because they shared something else, something the Kelvori had no word for and no defense against. Sevik ordered his remaining forces to consolidate at the center of the colony. He marched toward the holding area with every soldier he could gather, determined to regain control, determined to show these humans that the Dominion did not retreat from farmers and their pets. He found Meera standing in front of the colonists. She was standing in the open, with nothing left, the wind pulling at her hair and her clothes still stained with Sergeant's blood. And Sergeant was beside her, bandaged with strips torn from a colonist's shirt, his wounds still seeping, his body battered and exhausted, but his eyes open, and his growl steady and constant, like the idle of an engine that has never once been turned off. Sevik stared at the child and the animal, and for a moment the entire colony was frozen in the space between 1 second and the next. Then the communication array behind him lit up, not with a message from his troops, but with a transmission from the Dominion flagship in orbit. And the voice that came through was not a captain's voice or an admiral's voice, but the voice of someone much higher, someone with the authority to override a commander on the ground. And what the voice said was very simple. Recall all forces immediately. Withdraw from the planet's surface. Do not engage further with the human population. Protest. And the voice spoke again. This is not a request, Commander. Someone in high command has accessed the classified file on Sol 3, the one that was sealed after the first scouting mission returned with half its crew dead and a single note in the mission log. Rin, standing behind Sevik, already knew what the note said. She had found it 3 hours ago, buried in an archive that should have been reviewed before any Dominion ship ever entered a system containing humans. The note had 6 words. Do not return. The entire planet. The Dominion fleet left Verath 6 at dawn. The ships rose from the crushed grain fields and climbed through the copper-colored sky and vanished one by one into the dark above, like embers drifting upward from a fire that someone had decided was no longer worth the burn. The colonists stood in the open and watched them go in silence, because there was nothing to say that the silence did not already say better. Commander Sevik was reassigned within a week. Not punished, not court-martialed, just quietly moved to a monitoring station on the far edge of Dominion space, where the most exciting thing that happened in a standard year was a supply delivery. It was the kind of post you gave someone when you wanted them to disappear, without making it look like you wanted them to disappear. He went without protest, and he never spoke publicly about Verath 6, and the few officers who served with him said he was not the same after, that he flinched at small animals, and could not sleep without lights on. The mineral rights claim on Verath 6 was dropped. No explanation was given, no apology was issued, no compensation was offered. The Dominion simply erased the claim from its records as though it had never existed. And if anyone in the colonial administration asked why, they were told it was a clerical correction and given a look that suggested further questions would not be welcome. Sub-Officer Rin was promoted. This surprised her more than anything else that had happened. She had expected reassignment at best, and disciplinary review at worst, for her failure to prevent the incident. But instead, she was called to the Dominion capital and told she was being given command of a newly created division within Dominion Intelligence, the Terran Assessment Bureau. Its mandate was simple in language and terrifying in scope: compile a complete threat analysis of Earth and its dominant species, focusing not on their military capability or their technology, but on their biology, their psychology, and above all their relationships with other living things. Rin accepted the position and began her work. The first line of her first report became the most quoted sentence in Dominion intelligence history. "We have been classifying humans as the threat. This is incorrect. The threat is everything that loves them." The report took 4 months to complete, and when it was finished, it was 600 pages long, and every page made the Dominion's strategic picture worse. Rin documented everything, starting from the beginning, starting from the Ice Ages, when a species of hairless apes on a mid-range death world looked at wolves. Actual wolves, apex predators with jaws that could crush bone, and thought not, "How do I kill this?" but "How do I make this my friend?" She documented 40,000 years of coevolution between humans and dogs, how the wolves that stayed near human camps gradually became something new, something that could read human facial expressions and respond to human emotions, and would defend human children with their lives. She documented horses, how humans took a prey animal built for running and turned it into a partner that would carry them across continents and into wars and through deserts. She documented hawks and falcons that humans taught to hunt and return to the hand, bound not by chains but by a relationship that both species seemed to choose freely. She documented cats, and this was the part that disturbed the High Council the most, because cats were apex predators that had domesticated themselves, creatures that humans brought into their homes and fed and sheltered despite receiving almost nothing practical in return. The Council asked Rin why humans would do this, and she said she did not know, and that this was precisely the point. Humans formed bonds with other species not because it was efficient, but because something in their neurology made it feel necessary. And that instinct had produced an ecosystem of interspecies loyalty that had no parallel anywhere in the known galaxy. She documented elephants that mourned their human keepers and returned to the places where those keepers had died. She documented dolphins that swam alongside human boats for generations without any reward. She documented a gorilla that learned human sign language and asked for a pet cat and grieved when the cat died. She documented humans strapping cameras to eagles and microphones to whales and medical devices to dogs, and the dogs wagging their tails through all of it because the dog did not care about the technology. The dog cared about the human. The report was classified at the highest level and distributed only to the 12 members of the Dominion High Council. Rin was summoned to present her findings in person, which was an honor she did not want, because the room where the council met was cold and dark, and the 12 figures who sat in their elevated chairs had the power to commit genocide with a single vote. They asked her the question she had been expecting since the day she started writing. Can they be conquered? Rin stood in the center of that cold, dark room, and she looked up at the 12 most powerful beings in the Dominion, and she gave them the answer she had spent 4 months building toward. You would not be conquering one species. You would be declaring war on every creature that has ever looked at a human and chosen to stay. Every dog that has slept at their feet for 40,000 years. Every horse that has carried them into fire. Every hawk that has returned to their hand. Every honey badger that has stood beside their children and fought until it could not stand. You would be declaring war on every organism on a planet that spent 4 billion years perfecting the art of killing, and then produced one species that walked up to the survivors and said, "Would you like to be friends?" And the survivors said yes. She paused, and the silence in the chamber was absolute. I advise against it. The Council voted unanimously to reclassify Earth from Class 4 to Class 7, a designation that had only been assigned to 2 other worlds in Dominion history, both of which were uninhabited. The reclassification carried with it an automatic exclusion zone of 50 light-years and a standing order that no Dominion vessel was to enter Sol system without High Council authorization. Back on Verath 6, life went on. The colonists rebuilt the buildings the Dominion had torn down and replanted the fields that had been crushed under alien landing gear. Tomas healed slowly, because old men heal slowly. But he healed completely, because stubborn men heal completely. And within a month, he was back in his conservation enclosure, rebuilding what had been destroyed, bringing the hawks back to their perches, and finding new rabbits to replace the ones that had scattered. The story spread. A sanitized version reached the galactic news networks, and from there, it spread to human stations and colonies and outposts across the frontier. People laughed about it, in bars and mess halls and living rooms, because the idea of a 7-year-old girl and a honey badger sending the Dominion home was exactly the kind of story humans loved to tell about themselves. It became a joke, a legend, a piece of frontier mythology that grew a little bigger every time someone told it. On human colonies, children started naming their pets Sergeant. The Dominion did not laugh. In war rooms and intelligence centers across their empire, officers studied Rin's report and revised their threat assessments and quietly canceled expansion plans that would have taken them too close to human space. They did not do this because of warships or weapons, or any of the things the galaxy usually feared. They did it because of a 600-page report that said, in essence, you are not fighting one enemy, you are fighting a world, and the world has been practicing for this longer than your civilization has existed. Years passed. Meera grew taller and quieter and steadier. She finished school at the colony's small education center, and started helping Tomas with the conservation work, learning the names of species and the science of ecosystems, and the delicate art of earning an animal's trust. She was not famous, and she did not want to be. She was just a girl on a frontier planet who had once whispered a word in the dark and changed the way an empire thought about her species. Sergeant grew older too. His muzzle went gray, and his scars faded to pale lines beneath his thinning fur, and he moved slower than he used to. But he still followed Meera when she walked the perimeter of the colony in the evenings, and he still growled at anything that came too close. And he still slept outside her window, in a patch of sunlight, because he had earned the right to sleep wherever he wanted, and no force in the galaxy was going to tell him otherwise. One evening when Meera was 15, she was walking the perimeter with Sergeant at her side, when a Kelvori trade ship passed overhead. It was keeping its distance, maintaining the very edge of the exclusion zone, its hull catching the last light of the setting sun. Meera stopped and watched it go, and Sergeant stopped beside her, and looked up and grumbled low in his throat, the way he always did when something entered his sky without permission. Meera smiled, and rested her hand on his old, scarred back. The ship kept its distance. It knew better.